as a committee member here at San Diego Inventors Forum. I present each year and talk about different aspects of licensing. I've licensed, if I really had to count, hundreds and hundreds of products over 15 years or so. Thank you. I've licensed products in-house. I've licensed products out. I've licensed products to small companies you've probably never heard of. I've licensed to big companies you all have heard of: Ford, Microsoft, IBM. I've done product development, software development, high tech, low tech, you name it. I've probably been involved one way or another. And a lot of with you in different capacities, having spoken with you about your product and where you want to go and what you want to do with your intellectual property. So if you're here tonight, you're obviously interested in intellectual property. How many of you are interested in licensing your intellectual property? Okay. How many of you have an idea of what that entails other than a way to make money? Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about that right now. So with my disclaimer up, I am not an attorney. I am a licensing specialist and intellectual property specialist. So essentially what I do is I look at what have you got to offer, who do you want to offer it to, how do you want to offer it, and how do we get there, and we construct a deal, right? A lot of it entails business strategy, business planning, some business acumen, and certainly then a very well-defined, well-constructed contract to lay the foundation for all of that. So we're going to talk about some aspects of that today. Some things we're going to kind of gloss over because last month, if you were here, we did have a presentation on licensing, on intellectual property, kind of the basics. And with that foundation, this should make sense to most of you. So, to kind of get things going, just to repeat what you probably saw and heard last month is with regard to what is intellectual property. And it encompasses a body of things. So patents, copyrights, trademarks, and trade secrets, all of which encompass intellectual property. Any product or service that is sold encompasses most, if not all, of these things, which are all divisibly licensable, all things which you can likely make money from. But you need to strategize, understand what you've got, and understand how to do that. One of the things you need to know before you even can get started is kind of start to lay out your roadmap, lay out your foundation. What is your status of your intellectual property portfolio? So, what patents and trademarks and copyrights and service marks and trade secrets, what do you have? Know your status, how you filed it, when you filed for protection, who filed it, what was filed for, particularly in the case of patents and trademarks and copyrights. Copyrights, you have one of two options. You can go and register and get federal protection. You can start off without that. Any written documentation doesn't necessarily require it. But if you want to go after someone for infringement, then there's other things that have to happen, including registration. And then you want to know, for instance, particularly in the case of patents, how much time do you have to proceed, either to the next stage in the patent prosecution phase, or even more importantly, how much time do you have for patent protection to then be able to develop a licensing deal? If you're if you've sat on this for 18 years and you've got 2, maybe 3 years left, the value may not be as great as when you get started early. And then important is who's working with you, who's preparing your documentation, who's leading you and guiding you and helping you along the way. License companies are going to ask you these types of things, and you need to know. If you are one of these self-help gurus, I suggest that you go get the help that you need to transition yourself along this way. Self-help can get you into some navigational waters that you may not be able to get yourself out of. So while it might be nice to attempt to do by yourself, I don't highly recommend it if you want to go down the path of a successful licensing strategy. So how many of you would walk down the street and blindly marry the first person you see? You got some risky risk takers in here. Before you can license your product, you need to know it. You need to know it inside out, upside down, backwards. You wouldn't want to step into a marriage without knowing who it is that you're getting involved with, who it is you're going to get married to, and what's their background, what is their intent. If you can't describe what your product is, what function or purpose it serves. If you can't describe, how the world will be improved by your product or service, or what benefits it provides to a licensee, how can you easily describe it? If you can't talk to it, if you can't describe it, if you can't explain it, then you're dead in the water. So you really need to come up with a summary plan of what it is. Is there a concept behind what it is that you want to license? And we're going to talk about this part here a couple of times throughout the presentation because it's very important to understand this and how critical this can be to monetizing your IP. When I talk about a concept, I'm talking about a single product concept, the razor blade model per se, where you have a product and you have, once it's done, it's done. So you got to look for ways to capture that consumer or that person over and over to rebuy that product. You might have a multi-concept product. You've got one part and you've got an accessory part. How do you monetize that separately, as a bundled product, or have another accessory line or subcomponent that goes with it? And is it a whole product? Is it the whole shebang? Is it everything that one person needs? Maybe it's just an ingredient or a subcomponent. Understand what it is and what you can do with it, and maybe you can do more than one. Don't sell yourself short. You might fit into more than one of these buckets, okay? Marketability. Where does it fit in the market? Where does it fit in your potential licensee's portfolio? You can't expect them to go outside of their norm to want to license your product. The pitfall of that is they might not necessarily know how to get you there. If they're stepping outside of their sandbox, it might be a kind of treacherous sandbox to come out of. So then we talk about future selling strategy. Digital and social mediums are extraordinarily changing the landscape of intellectual property opportunities. One great example is Angry Birds. How many of you know what this is? Okay. I've never played the game before. I'm not a gamer, but I know so much about this, it's ridiculous. Angry Birds started off as what? A free video game on an iPhone or smartphone. I don't believe that at the time that developer put that product out, one, that it was going to be so phenomenally successful, or two, that in a short time they would have reached global expansion. They've taken a simple, almost nothing constructed video game to character expansion. There's now TV and movie rights, there's retail, there's clothing, there's slot machines, housewares, clothing, bedding, all kinds of unimaginable intellectual property now associated with this video game. You can't walk into a department store and not see some reference to this video game in its play. They probably didn't know it in the beginning, but they know it now, right? Somebody has figured out a way to take this beyond the reaches that were first imagined. You need to understand that and think about that thing. Explore those things. Is there opportunity for my product to get into these other mediums and markets, and how does social media impact that? Without social media, Angry Birds would have just been a video game that might not have made it out of the box. Social media played a huge part in where it is today. Sales cycle and timing. How many of you think Christmas is the best time to get your product out there? Good. None of you are raising your hand. So that's good because it is, but yet it isn't. When we talk about getting a product out into the retail market, Christmas may or may not be the best time. Certainly there's a premium for shelf space. Opportunities may be limited. The cost of production are probably higher to get it out there in time. The wait times may be longer because there's probably a ton of other products in process or manufacture that are far ahead of yours. And when you look at the market itself, you've got to pay to get the attention that drives those sales. And that may or may not be your product. So think about that when it comes to timing and when and how you want to get that to market. And then again, what are prospects for future innovation? So what comes next? When we talked earlier about product concept and what your product can do and what are the accessories or subcomponents or the things, also think about what comes next. Do you have the future capacity, you or your licensee, to develop derivative products from this or take it in another direction? Or are you simply a one-hit wonder? That might be a problem in the future if you're talking about a long-term royalty stream. Okay? Then you want to know, going back to the analogy of marriage, you want to know who your licensee is. You want to know what their current products are. You want to know where they're currently sold or distributed. You want to be able to go to the store shelf and do your research. I've got some slides I'll show you later if you're interested. But you can walk around your house on any store shelf and pick up any product that has a label on it and get some useful information. This water bottle alone tells me not only that it's a Kirkland brand product, but it's let's say, bottled by Niagara Bottling Company, Ontario, California, even got a phone number and a website, distributed by Costco, all of their contact information, as well as some other useful tidbits of information. They'll tell you who distributes it, who manufactures it, where. Really good starting point if you don't know where to begin. So just go to the store, picture, where does my product fit here? Where can I imagine this 6 months, 9 months, a year or so down the road, and get some basic information to start with there. Another thing to think about with your licensee is, are there other considerations that matter to you? If any of you were here a couple of months ago when we had Greg Cokes from Stone Brewery, he talked about his company's philosophy and his personal philosophy about environment and having certain things that were important to him basically inbred in his company and the services that they provide. Some of these things may or may not be important to you. Some of these things may or may not be important to your prospective licensee, but they're things that you should probably consider. Sourcing of materials. Is that here on domestic soil? Is it on foreign soil? How do they do it? Who do they do it? What are the conditions behind the people who are producing those goods and services? And how are they getting them to market? Do they have a responsible supply chain to support that? And what are those other requirements, the health, the human, the environmental, the recycling capacity, that may end up at some point having a negative effect on your product? So just think about those considerations too, because they all come into the deal and how you want to structure it. And then consider this. There might be a product here in the US that may be either the company's number one or the product itself is number one. But remember, not everywhere is everything number one. And not everywhere is everything really, truly worldwide recognized. So if you think of like Stanley Tools, a very well-respected, well-known tool company here in the United States, I don't think they have a very large presence in Asia or Latin America. So when you talk about licensing and your strategy and where you want to go, and we'll get into this a little bit more, giving them a license to go into Asia or Latin America might not necessarily be a good idea. You might want to find another player for your other markets. Once you've kind of figured out who you want to work with, you have an idea that yes, this fits, this is a partner that I want to do business with, there are a lot of other things still to consider. So you want to know when or how long it's going to take them to monetize your IP. When are you going to start getting paid? Okay? And how are they going to maximize it? Because the opportunity is not to get out there and make the minimum amount of money possible. It's to make the most amount of money possible. So you want to figure out what is their strategy to do that. Some ways to do that are through incremental sales. They're through looking at other consumer opportunities. It's the mobile commerce. It's the social media. How do they attract their customers? How do they keep their customers? How do they engage beyond the sale to keep them coming back and potentially be interested in wanting whatever that next product might be, if in fact you're not a one-hit wonder? And then talk about how have they done this before? Have they had any problems? It's easy to do some research and find out if they've ever had any litigation over intellectual property or licensing rights or distribution deals. There's a huge intellectual property licensing deal between JCPenney and Bodom Housewares. Bodom is a very, renowned kitchenware company. I believe they're a German company. who did a licensing deal with Kmart to have these little boutique in-store deals in their retail locations, and it went south bad. And there's a lawsuit over that. And part of that lawsuit entails issues with how the licensing was structured. Particularly, it did not fit the corporate strategy that JCPenney has established over all of their years in business. How many of you would consider going to JCPenney as your first possible or even top 10 source for buying a $100 kitchen knife? There you go. They tried something different. It didn't necessarily fit within their corporate strategy, and it's not boding well for either of those two companies at this time. So figure it out. Make sure that you have a partner that works for you and works with you well. And then talk about the partners in the supply chain. Are they going to do all of the manufacture, all of the distribution, all of the sale, all of the promotion? Probably not. So you want to know who their partners are in that whole supply chain. A lot of things you got to ask your licensee. Who are their promotional partners? So going back to the example of Angry Birds, some of those things were probably so pie in the sky and possibly not even recognizable at that time. Other things it is. And you want to be able to envision that possibility. So you look at, where can I expand this? You know, when Disney does a toy promotion or puts out a new movie, they're thinking about these kinds of things because they have 101, if not more, different ways to monetize any sort of Disney character. You know, in one respect, if you look at a figurine, Disney might partner with a licensee to produce a mini figurine. Let's say Spider-Man. I don't know, who's coming out now? Is there a movie coming out? Avenger or Thor? Okay. They might produce a Thor doll or figurine. They might also have a partnership with let's say a QSR, for instance, a quick service restaurant like a McDonald's or Jack in the Box or Carl's Jr. or whomever, to sell or provide a miniature version of that same guy as part of a kids meal deal. As a parent or someone who may be interested in buying one of these because your kids just need one of these figurines, when you talk about constructing a licensing deal, how many of you would go out and buy the $10 to $20 figurine off the Target or Walmart store shelf when you can go down the street and get virtually the same thing for $2 and make the kid happy? The reason they do that is to monetize their opportunities, but at the same time, the way they carve that deal is they're not necessarily the same. That little guy might not have all of the same features. He might not be bendy. He might not talk. He might not do those things that are really exciting and super cool and really want the kid to be satisfied with you having bought them the Thor doll. They're going to still want to go for the big guy. But you've got to structure the deal so that when you carve these things up, you're not competing with yourself in the same markets necessarily. So that's one more thing to think about. And then the retail and marketing relationship. If they don't already have an established partnership with a retailer, it's going to be pretty hard to get one established at the time you're trying to get a product to market. So make sure that they know who they're going to partner with in that relationship, and it's a done deal already. And then how is it managed, and how do they manage aftermarket support, particularly when it comes to managing customer complaints and returns, which are going to impact your royalties later on. So you have now, you know what you've got to offer. You know what they've got to offer. Now you're ready to start thinking about constructing a licensing deal. There are a lot of other things to consider, and we're going to gloss over some of these things, but I want to talk to them high level. Now, one of the very, very first considerations is whether to enter into a monogamous marriage or a polygamous marriage, if you will, with your licensing strategy. While marriage may be great for everyone or most of us, in a licensing deal, it might not be your best deal. So when we talk about that, we talk about non-exclusive. This allows you an opportunity to work with possibly multiple partners across multiple market segments, channels, geographic regions, price points, applications, where one licensee may not be able to get the whole job done. We talked earlier about Stanley. possibly not being a major tool leader in Asia or Latin America. So you might not want to give Stanley an exclusive deal when you can go carve up other markets with other retailers or other manufacturers or other distributors. When you carve up using a non-exclusive basis, you get a better opportunity to more fully exploit and monetize your intellectual property. Whereas when you go on an exclusive basis, you're putting all your eggs in one basket. There's no more dating. The deal's done. Now we hope everything works out. Okay? We talk about non-exclusive. Other things to consider are field and scope of use. So there are probably more ways than you can think of to carve up a licensing deal, some of which I've already touched on: geographic, class of product, where it's sold, how it's sold. Those are things that you want to consider when we talk about field or scope of use. Then we've got payment requirements and considerations. How are you going to get your money? And I'm going to go deeper into that in a couple of other slides. The term and duration. How long are you going to stay in this relationship? And how long is triggered by, are you making money? Are they meeting their requirements? And is everything working out? If it's not, then there are other trigger points to get you out of the deal. But think about who it is you're partnering with and how long you want to be in that relationship. Audit requirements are very important because, again, we're talking about getting your product to market and getting it sold, right? So you want to have an opportunity to go in and check in on things. How is the process of manufacture going? How are things getting to product? Have there been any delays? Are there any issues with somebody cooking the books? You want to make sure you give yourself some opportunity there to go in and figure out what's going on. And then we'll touch on that a little bit later. Continued rights to use during the license term. IP rights. So we talked about, where you have in your intellectual property portfolio to license. Defense and enforcement are a big key when it comes to patents, particularly, and trademarks later on. You want to carve out, understand, and set forth who's responsible for those things. Because if you're not enforcing them and you're not defending them, then you're going to lose them. You're going to lose those rights. And if, in particular, if going back to that multi-concept idea or opportunity to go beyond just a one product, a one-hit wonder, there may be opportunities to improve that product, to come out with something better. How is that process going to work? Who's going to own it? Who's going to manage it? And then going forward, who's going to defend and enforce that? Some licensing is on here, but you see I've got it struck out. It's a big reason for that. If I give you the keys to my car, I'm expecting you to be the only one driving that car. If you then turn around and hand them to the next guy, I don't necessarily know who's driving my car. I don't know that you don't drive drunk. I don't know that you don't do drugs. I don't know that you don't fly down the freeway at 100 miles an hour. When you get into sub-licensing, you get into a territory of risk. And it's not necessarily a path that you want to go down unless you fully understand how sub-licensing works, because you become further and further removed from understanding who has your intellectual property, what they're doing with it, and how it's affecting your overall opportunities. Exit strategy. Nobody likes to think that they're going to enter into a relationship and immediately have to think about how to get out of this. When you say I do and all that goes with that, you're not instantly thinking at the back of your mind, how am I going to get out of this? Right? You're hoping that there's a long-term relationship there. But in a licensing deal, you have to. It's a must. You need to understand how you're going to regain control of your intellectual property if the deal doesn't work out. How are you going to deal with their failure to meet the contract requirements? Even if things go well, and you do a 2-year deal or a 3-year deal, maybe it didn't go bad, but you have a better opportunity somewhere else. So there may be just a point of natural termination that you have to address. Discharge of remaining inventory. We call this the tail. If you've got products that are out there in the market, and now you've ceased doing business with this distributor, licensee, whatever the case may be, there's all this product in inventory. What's going to happen to it? You've got to figure out what happens to that. Does it get destroyed? Hopefully not. Is there an opportunity to transfer that to your new business partner that you're dealing with? Or do you just simply give them an opportunity to sell that stuff off And that way you're still making money off of it. Nobody's going to make money if the stuff has to get destroyed. Both of you are going to lose. They're going to lose and you're going to lose. So you want to look for opportunities to sell that stuff off. And then certainly you want to think about the fact that, hey, I'm marrying you. But what happens if they get bought out or get acquired or go away? You've got to think about what happens then, right? So you want to understand what happens in the event that there's a change of control. So now what you really want to know is, how do I get paid? What's the best way to get paid, and what's the most I can get? Well, I'm going to tell you probably 3 or 4 times throughout this presentation. There is no uniform royalty rate, okay? It's not 7%, it's not 13%, it's not 2%. It's going to be whatever the deal constructed can withstand. And that's based on many factors. And I want to dive into this a little bit more. So a couple of options when we talk about royalties, and I've just listed a few here. So fully paid royalty-free. One shot, bang, I'm going to get as much money as I can, and I'm walking out. And then whatever happens, happens. If Angry Birds had done that, oh, can you imagine how insane that person would be, or the persons would be, if they had probably done a deal like that? When given, hey, it's just a silly little video game played on the phone, to what it is now, insane. Upfront payments. Some people say, hey, you know, I don't have the money to finish getting this patent through. I'm going to need another $10,000 to $15,000. I don't have this money. Can you, as my licensee, front me some of that money? Remember, a loan is not free. There are things that there are strings attached to that. So the more you ask for, the less you're going to get in return. Definitely over the short period, and then you have to look at how it's going to impact you over the long haul. Royalty-based. Basically, this is rent. How long do they have a license is how long they're going to pay. And they can pay that based on a number of ways. They can pay it based on sales, gross or net revenues. They can pay it based on volume. They can make it based on a minimum guarantee. There are a lot of different things that you can put into this, but you have to understand what each of them do and what they don't do. Think about currency. Currency in where the product is sold is going to have a factor in how your royalty is calculated. So think about that as well. Advanced royalties are similar to this upfront payment, but sometimes they go, hey, you know, I just need a couple extra bucks. I can help you go talk to some marketing contacts. Again, any of these things that you ask for up front are going to affect you downstream somewhere. We'll talk about milestones adjustment in a minute. But let me ask you this. How many of you work? Actually have a paying job? Come on. Economy's not that bad. How many of you take home every red cent of that hard-earned dollar that you earn? Every single penny. No taxes, no FICA, no nothing. Take the stage. The same thing with royalties. You can say, I'm going to get 7%, or I'm going to get a buck off every one that's sold, however you construct the deal, but you're not going to get it all. Okay? There are allowable deductions, just like on your paycheck. These are negotiated. The ones on your paycheck are not necessarily so. You have to account for chargebacks, returns, customer dissatisfaction, samples. You know, maybe you want to flood the channel, go to trade shows, whatever it takes, get things out into the distribution stream. All of those, you're not going to get paid for those things. Those things are going to have an impact on how much you get paid in terms of your royalty. Patent activities. If you're relying on them to do patent prosecution or do any of those various things that involve high dollars, that's going to come out of your royalty. If you're asking them to undertake and manage all of the marketing opportunities, there's some ways to think about that. And I'll talk about those in a minute. Development, getting the product actually developed. And then you want to make sure that regardless of how many deductions that there are, you want to cap them. No more than X. No more than whatever. Because if you don't set a cap, if you don't set a framework, that big paycheck can go down to nothing or nearly nothing. It happens in the music industry all the time. People sign up, they get these whiz-bang deals, they think I got a #1 song, and then what do you hear? They're bankrupt. These artists are bankrupt because they got this big bankroll, this upfront payment to go blow and tell all their friends how successful they were, and they're fronting fees for that. And they're fronting fees for marketing, and they're fronting fees for touring, and they're fronting fees for the big RV that they're driving around, and all those other things. So think about how to cap that stuff, because if it affects them, it's going to affect you. Again, what did I say earlier? No uniform royalty rate. The lower the royalty, think about it. The more funds, the more opportunity to get the product to market, right? If you're trying to eat them all up on the front end, how are they going to have any money left to do anything on the back end? So think about that. If they're responsible for everything, then your royalty is going to be less. If you have some attributable expertise around the product or around a market or around an opportunity, show that value, either in the form of royalty or in the form of a consultancy fee or something along that line. But if you have an attributable value, use it in your deal. Talked earlier, just a moment ago, about marketing. You can set aside a percentage of your royalty fee or a sub-bucket to say, hey, I want X% of every product sold to go towards marketing. That way you're ensuring that this isn't a one-time thing, that they're going to put forth the effort to continue to market that product throughout its life cycle, right? You don't want a big whiz-bang celebration, a big coming out party to get the product on the market, and then that be it. And you hear crickets for the next 9 years. You want to make sure that they have a mechanism to keep that product going. And a marketing fund is a way to do that. Sure. So companies generally have their overall marketing budget. It may or may not be a budget that attributes directly to your product, but maybe their overall brand, their company. You want something that's going to have a focused delivery on getting your product to market, whether that's getting in catalogs, whether that's getting in social media. How are they actively going to promote it? And so you want to incentivize them to be able to do that, possibly even over other products that they may be manufacturing or producing or selling for maybe their other licensees. Like I said, you can do it as a percentage of. So if your royalty happens to be 7%, you can say, hey, let's take 1% of that and set that aside and focus that solely towards marketing efforts. Okay.
Is that still called a royalty at that point? If they're spending it, the licensee is spending the money.
If you're carving it out of your royalty, it's not, that 1% doesn't become a royalty back to you. What I'm saying is you can carve it out of your royalty, give them an incentive. You know, and if you don't know, there's a lot of actually opportunities for you to figure out how to get some licensing information. There are brokers out there. There are a lot of hoaxsters. There are a lot of really good people, but there are a lot of good resources too. epm.com.com, I know it sounds redundant, is a great tool for understanding licensing. They cover a very, very broad range of licensing and markets and applications. They can sell you information with regard to research and trends and customer behaviors and who's buying and who's selling. They actually publish I think it's quarterly report on what big major licensing deals have been done and who did them. You can get the exact name and contact information for someone at a licensing, in the licensing department of potential licensee through them. It's expensive. It's not cheap. But you can go to their website and invest, and that's a good way to start. I think their thing is called the licensing letter that you can subscribe to. Again, it's not cheap, but it's really, really good information. Now, having that said, I met with these folks back in July, and at that time, skip ahead for a minute. These are what the royalty rates were for these particular categories. So celebrity endorsement, how hot are you? Are you the next big thing? I bet you at one point Justin Bieber was about 14%. I bet you he's probably closer to 3% right about now. Because celebrities are humans, and they screw up, and when they do, it affects your brand. And you need to consider that if you're thinking about anything having to do with a celebrity endorsement or celebrity deal. Entertainment industry, automotive, and sports. So these are some numbers. And you can see, when I said there's no uniform royalty rate, 2 to 14%. That's a big gap. So think about that. So I also want you to think about when I talked about celebrities. Celebrities kind of play into this whole idea of co-branding. So there's a huge push and a front to get things co-branded because they have a lot of value. They can have significant value and get you to cross markets where maybe you didn't have that before. Some examples of that are Eddie Bauer and Ford. How many of you have heard of the Eddie Bauer limited edition Ford vehicles? Had one. Okay. A huge cross-branding opportunity that where both companies had a cross-licensing deal for that name and that value, right? Betty Crocker and Hershey, right? There's a lot of movement in the men's shaving grooming industry. If you go to the malls, you see these new high-end stores. You can go in and get a specialty shave. You know, they've just done a branding opportunity with Gillette. I think it's like a $200 razor, but hey, if it's working, it's working. But obviously there's some brand there. So you look at what the contribution of that brand is to each other, who's benefiting, and hopefully both of you are. And then again, going back to this contributing value, when I talked about what is the product, what can it do, and where is it going to go, and what are its future opportunities, a whole product is obviously has the biggest contributing value. It is everything. But when it's an ingredient, consider like the Betty Crocker Hershey. Wow, pretty big names. Hard to probably tell who's benefiting more from that deal, right? It's an ingredient in a Betty Crocker mix, but the value of those two brands coming together have very good weight. So that's enough on that. And then the distribution model and stream. I talked about that a little bit earlier with regard to getting the product to market, but what I want to make sure you understand about this too is the opportunities and places to sell retail brick and mortar are flattening. Online, they're growing, and in some cases, there's some bit of a reversal. But if you look at kind of what Walmart has done to the industry over the last many years, and if you look at what current retailers are doing, JCPenney's gamble with Bodom didn't necessarily work out, but Target has a very highly successful program and strategic plan where they bring in these designers to do these one-off, limited edition designer lines of clothing, and they are selling like hotcakes. It's working for them. So when you look at where you're going to sell the product, think about where your product fits. If you're going to sell a line of high-end $100 t-shirts, you need to go figure out who's selling those t-shirts first. Go to the stores, look and see what those brands are, and make sure that it fits, okay? Okay, and then obligations to commercialize. So, you know, you may have constructed the best royalty deal possible. You may think that you're getting the best that you can possibly get in terms of opportunity to money, but if they're not doing anything with it to actually get it out there and keep it moving and keep generating opportunities and keep generating revenue, you're going to miss out. So you got to look at what their obligations are to actually commercialize it, right? So you want to make sure that they have specific minimum targets and goals. If they can't meet the minimum, they're never going to get to the maximums, right? So you want to look at how they're going to get product developed, how long is it going to take them, and what are the efforts to develop it and market it. Agree to certain milestones and achievements. You know, if you're talking about a product from concept to commercialization, there are a lot of milestones and checkpoints along the way. You want to make sure that you have check-ins for all of those things, right? Because if you're saying that I want to get it from concept to commercialization within 6 months, that is a lot of things that have to happen within that 6 months. And they kind of all fall into these kinds of buckets, and you need to know what they are and make sure they're reasonable. If you're talking about a product that has to be spun up in molds and all kinds of other things created, 6 months may not be reasonable, and you're setting yourself up for failure as well as them. And then Last, get prepared. Take all of this information. Create for yourself a list, a checklist, a target of all of these things. Categorize them. Figure out where your product fits with all of these things. Kind of do it. I don't want to call them a term sheet because you're not ready for that yet. But it's basically the footprint, the foundation for, hey, if I'm going to do a licensing deal, I need to know this stuff first. So get your ducks in a row, pull your information together, and have this as basically your pre-plan before we start getting into the next step with regard to licensing. So that's as far as I'm going to take you on that, because it's a lot of information. It can go a lot of different ways. But I think a lot of questions that we get over the course of the year are really how do I get the product out there and how do I make money from it. And I think I've touched on both of those things for you tonight. We're going to have a panel afterward where Ben and I are going to come up and be here to be available to answer additional questions. But if you have a couple of little questions for me right now, I can answer them, or we can save them for the panel. Yeah.
It's two.
Yes.
My company is looking at prospective licensing, collaboration, co-product development deal with a company in Orange County. My question specifically is about style guides.
Yes.
I'm familiar with them. I know who uses them and why.
Mm-hmm.
This particular company kind of said, well, we like to kind of be loosey-goosey, and we don't like to play with the big studios that require that. And I took that in at the meeting, and then after the meeting, it kind of made my skin crawl.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering what your view is on whether to be hard and fast with visual creative for style guides.
Style guides, if you don't know what they are, they're kind of the framework for how do you want your product or your brand or your trademarks presented. They're used primarily when you talk about packaging or how your marks are used. So if you already have an established brand or trademark, you want to say, hey, this is how I want you to use it. Because if you distort from that, you distort the value of your trademark. You can create trademark problems for yourself. It can create confusion in the marketplace. So style guides are very important for those reasons and as well as some others. So if you have someone that's not willing to participate and follow your style guide, you're probably going to run into some potential problems down the road when it comes to enforcement and defense of either your patents or particularly your trademarks and your copyrights potentially and any packaging or design patents that maybe that you've secured. Mm-hmm.
They already have a licensing deal with the big company that I have been working with.
Okay.
So they're already playing with the big boys.
Mm-hmm.
And they're so large that they've got 500 designers in their stable.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, because they already have been playing with folks like that, can you really push back and say, this is really the way we want it to go?
You can always push back. I think in your case, where you run the risk is your stuff is very deliberate in terms of its design. Once they start stepping outside of what your design is, there's potential for creating derivative works, and then you get into, well, is it really yours or is it theirs, and who's going to own it? So I think your case is a little bit unique in that way, where it's probably a little bit more important for you than maybe in some other areas. Okay. Yep, one more, and then we'll do the panel.
What exactly do you do and what do you charge?
What do? I do all of this, all that you've seen. So when we talk about this model, this framework, so I have put together a very comprehensive, what I call IP checklist. It is the get down and dirty and get to know you and everything about you and your product and your potential licensee, so that we can potentially structure a deal that can get you to get your product out there. So essentially what it is it's working with you to develop your strategy, develop the framework, then work with you, and once you've identified a prospective licensee, to negotiate a licensing deal. I am not a broker. I am not going to go find your potential licensee for you. That is work that you can very readily and easily do yourself, or you can pay a ton of money to a broker to go do that for you, and they're going to take a big giant cut of it. But that's something that I expect as the owner of that intellectual property. You should be able to do that. There's so many resources out there that shouldn't be a problem for you. That
This
help?
is a field that if you haven't had the experience in doing it, it's like surgery. You just shouldn't do it to yourself.
Yeah.
This, all the cases, all the points that Leslie's pointing out are so valid. And if you don't have the forethought, you get into agreement, you're all quite excited when it first gets you some money up front. But if you haven't had that forethought, it's one of those, if you don't plan to fail, you fail to plan. Instances where this distributor, for example, that you got on board, a few years later, let's say they get bought out by a bigger company, and that bigger company no longer wants to carry all of those products. Where does that leave you? How do you exit from that? How do you buy back the excess inventory? This happens all the time, all these aspects. There's so many of them, and that's what Leslie's expertise is in identifying all of the facets and making sure you put some attention into those things and to construct your licensing agreement so you get the very best dollar and cent you can out of every deal.
I'm working on a deal right now that's a two-part. It's a breakup and a new marriage. When I say that, I'm talking about a licensing deal, right? So things didn't quite work out with the original licensee. Guess what? The contract was crap. Now how do we get out of that? And then what happens? And how do we get our product back? And how do we do certain things? At the same time, how do we not have this happen again? Okay? Nobody gets married and then gets divorced and gets right back into the same thing with somebody else. If you do, you have a big problem. And I don't want to have anything to do with it. But the opportunity here is not only to really teach a lesson, that don't get into this when you don't know what the next step is. Right now, they're looking at a very, what I call short-term thinking with regard to how they're going to manage and monetize this. Or actually, they're not initially thinking to monetize this. So I'm asking all these questions. Well, what about monetization? What about this? How is this company going to scale up? How are they going to take advantage of mobile? How are they going to do this? And they go, why are you looking at me like that? We haven't thought of that yet. Like, I need to step out of this then. So you got to think about all these things first before you bring someone like me into the room, and definitely before you write up your own licensing deal and take it very haphazardly and very eagerly to a licensee and go, I want to marry you. Okay? So, thanks.
Leslie?